Hello, everyone. My name is James Nicholas. I'm the Senior Product Marketing Manager here at BioCatch. And today we're launching a brand new series titled Threat Talk, where you'll hear directly from our threat analyst about the fraud trends they are seeing in the field and what problems are unique to the region. Today's Threat Talk features Erin Englund, head of the Threat Analytics team for North America. Erin has been working directly with BioCatch customers to solve complex problems since 2018. Erin, thanks for joining me today. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what a day in the life of a TA at BioCatch looks like?
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Erin Englund. I'm the lead threat analyst for North America with BioCatch. I've been with BioCatch for about 5 years, but I've been in the fraud industry for 20. So believe it or not. So day in the life, the threat analysts work directly with BioCatch customers to help consume our data, utilize our products to prevent fraud. So I like to think of it as, we're in the trenches with our customers. We're working alongside them to try to prevent fraud and also reduce friction to good customers and just make the world a safer place for users.
Excellent. So, I guess with that, the first question I have for you is what are some of the trends you've seen over the past 6 months and kind of going into the new year of 2023?
Yeah, so in the last 6 months, I mean, I look at two different sides. So there's account opening trends, just the creation of new accounts using stolen identities. And the other side of that is more account takeover. So, accessing unauthorized users, accessing, users' bank accounts. Um, in the ATO side, we're seeing a lot of things trending towards social engineering, scams. The scams can result in an account takeover event or unauthorized access. So we're seeing a lot of, phishing attacks. I know personally, I get phishing texts like nearly daily, and especially on holiday weekends, I tend to get a lot more, last weekend included. So uh, there's a lot of phishing attacks to get information from users, and that information is used against users to try to gain access to their accounts. So we see things like fraudsters trying to get one-time passcodes so they can make payments. Zelle is a huge pattern in the US specifically, because it is a real-time payment scheme, and fraudsters are hitting it quite heavily to try to get payments out as quickly as possible. And those payments, once they're out, they're gone, right? So in the account opening world, we're seeing a lot of creation of mule accounts, bots being used to create deposit accounts in pretty high proportions. And this is a really US specific trend. We're not seeing this pattern around the globe so much. It started with the CARES Act in 2021, accessing those funds that were reserved for unemployment, and different things. And although the CARES Act money has kind of dissolved at this point, we're seeing that, especially now that we're in tax season, there's still a lot of access to funds, and it was quite easy for fraudsters, but they're creating those accounts to accept those funds and then launder them outside the country.
So, with that, what are some of the recommendations you would have for banks and FIs to deal with these new trends?
So number one is to monitor the new trends, keep track of the trends. What are fraudsters doing? And number two, I would recommend banks to take an inventory of the current controls they have within the bank and what are areas that fraudsters could be exploiting, especially through social engineering attacks, any type of areas where they can get into the bank and go unnoticed. I would say definitely tackle those first two things. And next step would be identifying, what types of tactics need to be implemented to make your controls stronger and the bank a safer place.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned earlier, you and your team being kind of in the trenches, would you mind kind of going over, I guess, a use case or an anonymous customer example of how the threat analyst team can help our customers dealing with these fraudulent situations?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm working with a US customer now where they were definitely, we identified an attack over President's Day weekend. In fact, the bank told us that they typically do get targeted during holiday weekends. We also have noticed patterns within their environment that weekends in general tend to be where we see an increase in fraud attacks. And by fraud attack, I mean that we saw an increase in a new account opening, They were seeing about a 30% increase without having any kind of marketing strategy or any genuine reason to see that increase. So when we took a look, we saw some indications of bot behavior, and the bot behavior had shifted a bit. We were able to implement controls really quickly over the weekend to help them mitigate that exposure. But it's a good use case where we were partnering with the customer specifically to identify what was happening right now, and together we were able to tackle that quickly and alleviate any kind of damage done over the holiday weekend, as opposed to reacting after the fact and doing a bit of cleanup.
Absolutely. So shifting gears a little bit, you mentioned it earlier. I'd be remiss if I didn't find a way to shout out our mule account detection solution. So given your experience detecting these counts, would you mind telling the viewers a little bit about that experience and how important it is to detect the accounts before the damage is done?
Absolutely. So in mules in particular, my perception is that it's a growing problem in the U.S. I think it's quite pervasive in a lot of the U.S. banks, and different customers I work with have kind of varying degrees of what appears to be mule activity within the bank. It can be extremely costly, as the longer a mule account is kind of left to persist within a bank, they grow these massive networks. They work together. It's a very organized type of crime. But the costs are not just in, the fraud losses or any kind of, regulatory impacts, for anti-money laundering, but it can also be operational. The longer these mule accounts are left, they might be difficult to identify what type of a fraud attack it is. You might have an actual individual walking into a branch to appeal an account suspension, for example. You may be calling it first party fraud, account takeover, new account fraud. And so it just kind of grows as far as, operational costs, fraud losses, and obviously the implications of anti-money laundering. But it's also it's the type of activities that the mule accounts are funding. We don't want to allow that. They're funding things like illegal arms trade, human trafficking, illegal drugs. That money is going to terrorist organizations offshore. So stopping that quickly and at the source helps mitigate that damage and exposure within the bank.
Definitely. So, switching topics, I want to talk a little bit about behavior, specifically behavioral biometrics, and how does it affect current fraud stacks and platform integration?
So I think it's definitely an advantage to layer in with existing controls. So let's say, for example, using a device as your identifier for a user. That's typically used as, your online identity. It's tied to your device. So, occasionally people change devices. I personally dropped my iPhone a while back and had to replace that. And regaining access to all my online accounts was a pain, not having access to my previous device. So there's a lot more friction added, to that user experience. And who doesn't find that to be a major pain to try to access? Not to mention, helping some of my elderly family members regain access to their accounts. It's a major pain point. So adding behavior within the fraud controls helps identify those genuine users, reduce the rates of false positives, but also it can increase your fraud controls, the accuracy of your fraud controls. So, for example, seeing returning devices or known devices to a user that might be associated with a fraud event, like malware infected devices, for example, remote access tool scams. So those are different areas where behavior is another layer that tells you a better story about what the user's doing and if it is who they say they are.
I agree. And so, Aaron, thank you again for your time. And as we wrap up this first interview of the series, what are some of the final thoughts you would give banks and FIs? Just some general advice as dealing with the new fraudulent trends for 2023.
I would say empower your fraud teams. You've got your teams who are in the trenches. They want to protect your customers. They know what your vulnerabilities are. And I think they need to be empowered to have a voice within the organization. It's also important to be flexible. The example I gave where we were able to react really quickly at the first sign of a fraud attack over a holiday weekend. One of the reasons that fraudsters target holiday weekends, weekends in particular, is because they know that staffing is limited. They know that there's some vulnerabilities there, that if they attack a vulnerability or some kind of a loophole in the system, there might not be the right people in the office at the time to be able to stop that in time. And so a lot of damage can be done over a short period of time. So it's important to understand where your vulnerabilities are, but also to empower the appropriate teams to take action when necessary.
Thanks everyone for joining us today for the first Threat Talk from BioCatch's TA team. We're looking forward to bringing you more insights about fighting fraud next month. See you then.